While it's a museum today, Kingston Penitentiary once was a fearsome maximum security prison that housed some of Canada's most notorious criminals. In operation from well before Confederation until just about a decade ago, it became known for brutal conditions which came to a head 50 years ago today, with an uprising and standoff that gripped the country for 4 days. Catherine Fogarty is founder and president of Big Coat Media and Story Hunter podcasts, and is the author of Murder on the Inside, the true story of the deadly riot at Kingston Penitentiary. And she joins us now from the downtown core of the provincial capital for more. Catherine, it's great to meet you, and congratulations on getting this book done. I guess I want to start by asking you, what made you feel like you were the one who needed to tell this story?
That's a difficult question. It's a story that I found, and by accident. I found it one day, looking in the Globe and Mail, and they have, this day in history. And I saw this little article, and there was something that immediately caught my attention. I think what I was intrigued by was the fact that I had never heard about this riot. We all know about Kingston Penitentiary. It's our oldest prison. It's a national historic monument. But why had I not ever heard about this incident? So I cut out that little piece of paper and put it in a file folder called my ideas folder. And a couple years later, I pulled it back out and started, researching the story.
I asked the question.
So I don't know if I was the right person, but
well, no. I've read the book, and I can tell you it's fantastic, and you were the right person. But let me put it this way: I wouldn't necessarily have thought that somebody who is better known for executive producing a TV show, a reality TV show called Love It or List It, which I'm sure many of our viewers have seen, I wouldn't have thought the person responsible for that would have been necessarily the best choice for this, but clearly you were. What was it in your background that kind of led you to be interested in this story?
Well, before I got into television, I was originally a social worker. So my first career was in social work, and I had an undergraduate degree in sociology, anthropology, and had studied criminology. So, I think those early days kind of came background, and I've always been very interested in human behavior. So when I saw this story, as I said, something really intrigued me, and I wanted to know more. That was for certain.
Now, because this story took place 50 years ago, that means that some of the protagonists and antagonists from back in the day are still with us. How much cooperation did you get from either Corrections Canada, survivors of the riot, all of that kind of thing?
Well, unfortunately, because of the population that we're talking about, many of the people that were incarcerated at the time had lived very hard lives. So many of those people are no longer with us. But I did speak to a lot of retired correctional officers. I was very fortunate to meet with various groups. With respect to Corrections Canada, there was virtually no support in telling this story, which I discovered early on, and that was part of why I thought I need to dig deeper here, because I went into this naively. This is my first book, and I'm not a journalist. So I thought, this is, at the time when I started, it was a 45-year-old story, and I thought, let's talk about this. Let's go to Kingston. I drove down to Kingston, drove to the Penitentiary Museum, and I thought, why not? They're gonna welcome me with open arms, and that was not the case at all. It was quite the opposite.
Why do you think they were so unhelpful?
To talk about this. Well, because this is an embarrassment to the service. And things have moved so slowly in corrections that something for us that's 45 years ago, 50 years ago now, is still, many things are still happening that happened then. So this is still not something that they're willing to open up. If you go to Corrections Canada, or if you go to the Penitentiary Museum and you want to talk about what happened in the 19th century, they'll show you the torture items and different things, but this is still too close to home. They don't want to talk about it.
Well, here's Pat Devlin, who was an inmate whom you quote in the book, describing Kingston Penitentiary of 50 years ago, and he says, Kingston was a hellhole. It was an ancient prison run in an inhumane manner. There was the old-style discipline, someone hollering at you from the time you got up in the morning to the time you went to bed at night. Straighten up that line. Get your hands out of your pockets. Cut off those sideburns. Everyone was treated like a dog. Their idea of prison was to put a man in a cage and lock the door, and one day it just blew. Let's get some history here of Kingston Pen, which, as we point out in the introduction, goes way back to before even Canada was Canada. So take us back, the history of the place.
So the prison they started building it in 1833. It opened in 1835. And, from there on, there were, even within its first few years, there were issues. The first warden of the penitentiary was a brutal man. And of course, Agnes MacPhail in 1935, I believe, was very involved in prison reform and
First
tried to get
female
into.
MP.
That's right, and tried to get into Kingston Penitentiary. At first, she was denied. They said, a lady can't come into a penitentiary, and she said, "I'm no lady. I'm an MP." So, but she worked very hard to try to get reform because the situation. In the earlier days, I mean, it was a brutal, inhumane prison. Prisoners were not allowed to speak. From day to night. There was women in the prison. There were children in the prison, and it was as somebody's quoted saying, it was a hellhole, and that unfortunately did not change as time went on.
One of the things I was interested to learn when we talk about the prison of 50 years ago is that even among the prison population, there was a hierarchy. Right? There were people that were in there for murder and assault and bank robberies and various and other sundry things, and they were kind of at the top of the food chain. And who was underneath them?
What they called the undesirables. So in 1971 in Kingston Penitentiary, they didn't have a system what that we have right now, which was minimum, medium, and maximum. At Kingston Penitentiary, everybody was thrown in together. So you had vicious criminals, murderers, rapists in with a lot of young men, a lot of the men in my story who had robbed a grocery store, had stolen a pack of cigarettes. And a lot of these men were products of the system. They had, grown up in foster homes and foster care and group homes and reformatories, and then they just graduated up through the system. So they became products of that system. And as I said, some of the men in the story are 17, 18 years of age, and they're thrown in there with, as I said, very hardened criminals. And at the bottom of that pecking order were what they called the undesirables, which were sex offenders and rats, people that were perceived to have, either spoken out against another prisoner or stolen something from another prisoner.
And this
they
hierarchy,
were kept in protective.
Yeah, sorry. This hierarchy will become very important in the telling of the story, which we're going to do right now. Because on this day, 50 years ago, some spark lit the fuse that started a riot. What was the spark?
There had been, the spark had been smoldering for a while. I mean, again, the conditions were extremely inhumane, overcrowding, very poor relationship between custodial staff and inmates. But what the main spark was on April 14th, 1971, was the transfer of inmates to a brand new federal institution, which was called Millhaven. And on that day, the first 12 inmates were transferred over to this new Supermax facility. And as bad as Kingston Penitentiary was, the inmates knew, they knew what it was. But the fear of this new super maximum security penitentiary, that terrified them, and that was the spark.
So what was the mission, if I can put it that way, of the riot? What did they actually want to accomplish?
They wanted to, ultimately they wanted to be heard. They wanted people to come in. They invited the media. They invited a citizens committee. They said, come in and just see how the forgotten are treated in our society. Of course, they wanted better conditions. Of course, they wanted to be heard, to be seen. At that time, people were only addressed by their prison numbers and not their names. So they said, the gentleman who initiated the riot, Billy Knight, he said, you have taken our civil rights, but we want our human rights.
How willing, in your judgment, were the authorities? I mean, they did allow these journalists in. They did allow this citizens committee to act as a go-between and negotiate with the prisoners. So how much either credit or blame do you accrue to them for opening things up the way they did?
Well, I don't think they really did. I think they were forced to allow the Citizens Committee in because of the media attention that was happening at the time. As I said, they had invited the media to come in. So they did, the prisoners, the inmates did a press conference. So that went across the country. And they said, this is what we want. So I don't think the bureaucracy and the government really had a choice, but I certainly saw internal memos that were really trying to control who was on that citizens committee. For example, they did not want Ron Haggart, who was a well-known journalist. They did not want him there because they were afraid of what he was going to write about. But he did end up going there. So I don't think they had a choice, and they were trying to placate the media, and so they did allow them in, but they did not allow them any kind of authority or control over what was happening in the prison and what they could negotiate with the prisoners. So
now, once the riot broke out, 6 guards were taken hostage. How well or badly were they treated by the prisoners?
They were treated very well by the prisoners. And, that's one of the stories that I wanted to talk about, that it is very unfortunate that they were taken hostage, and it was terrifying for them. I have met with, there's only one surviving guard from the 6 that were kidnapped, and I have spoken with him extensively, and 50 years on, this is still quite a haunting memory for him, and very difficult for him to talk about. But he has talked about how the fact that they were protected, the inmates did not want any harm to come to those prison guards, because they knew that if that happened, then everybody would perish, as happened 5 months later in Attica. Very similar situation. So they created an entire system where they were guarding those the correctional officers with their lives to make sure that they were protected.
Now, I'm glad you brought up Attica, because I suspect Canadians know more about Attica and the prison riot there, maybe mostly because of what Al Pacino screamed when he was coming out of the bank on Dog Day afternoon. But regardless, that went very badly when Governor Rockefeller ordered the storming of the prison, and nearly 50 people died, 10 of whom were guards. So it's worth putting on the record that that did not happen at Kingston Pen, right?
It did not happen, and I certainly credit the individuals on the Citizens Committee, particularly Ron Haggart, who was negotiating, into the wee hours of the night, and one of the other prisoners, Barry McKenzie, who was never acknowledged as a hero of this riot. But if it wasn't for cool heads and level heads, the exact same thing would have happened within a matter of hours, because there was over 500 well-armed guards on the outside of the prison, and the government had said they have till Monday morning, otherwise we're going in. So the exact same thing could have happened, but there are some heroes that prevented that from happening.
Well, let us set that scene a little more, because Prime Minister Trudeau, the father, was not available to sort of be in charge of this operation, because he was on his honeymoon at the time with Margaret Trudeau.
Yep.
So it was the Solicitor General, Jean-Pierre Goyer, I guess, who was sort of running the operation for the feds. Who made the decision that they thought it would be a good idea to get soldiers from nearby Canadian Forces bases to fix bayonets onto their rifles and surround the prison and threaten the place?
Well, that was the government's decision. I mean, they had, again, in 1971, the administration at the prison, they had no riot plan in place. So the first thing that they did was they did contact the local military battalion and said, be on standby. So, and they contacted the Kingston police to notify them, but then they didn't ask for any of their assistance. So as the days wore on, the government instituted more and more military presence at the prison. So
now here's where I get back to asking you about the hierarchy within the prison, because while the prison guards were not killed, prisoners were killed. And you,
yes.
I have to say, you spared almost no detail in describing the excruciating torture that I guess some of the prisoners who were at the lower end of the pecking order suffered in this riot. I guess I want to start there. Why did you feel a need to describe what happened to them in really such agonizing detail?
Well, just to go backwards, I mean, the first book, there is one other book that was written about the Kingston Penitentiary riot, and that was by Roger Caron, who wrote Go Boy, and won, the Governor General's Award for that book. And then several years later, I believe in 1985, he wrote about his experiences in the prison at the time. He was in Kingston Prison. So when I read that book, of course, read the very descriptive scenes of what happened on the last night of the riot, and I was also told that don't believe everything that is in this book. So I needed to know for myself, had Roger Caron embellished the situation? Had he created scenes that didn't happen? So I had to go through a lot of paperwork and a lot of appeals to get the original trial transcripts from the government, and the eyewitness statements. And to my shock, I discovered that what Roger Caron had wrote about had not in any way been embellished. It was all true. And so I felt I needed to put that in, because that's exactly what happened.
How did the standoff eventually come to a reasonably peaceful conclusion?
Well, the standoff, again, it was, Ron Haggart and one of the inmates who were negotiating all through the last night. And they finally came up with a solution that they would release one guard, on a pro rata basis for a number of the inmates, 100 inmates. Unfortunately, some guns went off and the inmates panicked, and they all rushed through a very narrow corridor through the prison, and panic ensued. But eventually they were able to get everybody out and then go back into the prison and find out what had happened. They didn't know, the authorities, they didn't know what had happened on that last night when the undesirables were tied up and put in a circle and beaten to death. So they had no idea what they were going to find when they went into that prison. They assumed dozens had been killed.
It's probably worth putting on the record the fact that while there were some prisoners who acted quite responsibly, and you mentioned Barry Mackenzie's name already, how he helped bring what could have been a disaster to a more peaceable conclusion, there clearly were a lot of inmates in there who just wanted to raise hell, who just wanted to create absolute mayhem and havoc. All right, if Mackenzie's one of the heroes of the story, who, in your view, are some of the villains of the story?
Well, there were 13 inmates charged with murder after the prison riot, and the leader of that group was a man by the name of Dave Shepley. And that group of inmates, took matters into their hands and took advantage of a situation and said, they assumed that the police, the riot squads and the armor were coming in. So they said, you know what, we've got nothing to lose. We're going after, the weakest group in this prison, and that's what they did. I mean, they pulled 16 men out and tortured them beyond what we really even want to talk about, because as you said, it's absolutely horrific what happened. So they they took they certainly took advantage of the situation. But again, there were over 600 inmates in this riot. Those are 13 men that were charged. Were there other people involved in this? Yes, but again, you had hundreds of men being forced to watch what was going on, and had no ability to stop what was happening.
And of course, the story didn't end there, because when the prisoner transfers to Millhaven did in fact take place, there were, I think, more than a dozen guards from Millhaven who were also charged with assault because of what they did to the prisoners after that transfer. So things didn't quiet down after the Kingston Pen riot was over.
No, and that's part of the story that nobody's ever written about before. So when I discovered that, it was quite alarming. When they were trying to negotiate a peaceful end to the riot, Barry McKenzie and the other inmates said, we need protection because we know there's going to be retaliation. And even the gentleman on the Citizens Committee said, we will make sure that doesn't happen. We will protect you. And I know Ron Haggard said later on, many years later, that one of his biggest regrets was never getting on one of those buses that went to Millhaven, because when those buses went to Millhaven, the inmates were taken off the buses and beaten with billy sticks. So beaten severely. And then they were put in solitary confinement in Millhaven, and it was very hard for them. Luckily, a couple of them were able to get in touch with their lawyers to say, this just happened to us. Somebody needs to come in here and look at what just happened. So that was another huge incident that the corrections tried to keep hidden, but it did come out.
Catherine, just in our remaining moments here, I want to bring the story fast forward to today, because I know when I got to the end of the book, the first question I asked myself was, geez, I wonder if it's better today. I sure hope it is. And then remember saying to myself, geez, I fear it is not any better today. But you'd know. Tell me.
Mm-hmm. I've thought about this so much, and when the prison riot happened, I was 5 years old. So I thought, isn't it amazing to look at this historical story and then say to yourself, well, wow, like things are exactly the same, if not worse. Things are not any better in our federal penitentiaries. We still have overcrowding. We still have so many issues that, it's alarming how things have not changed, and the issues that the inmates were talking about 50 years ago, we're still talking about today. And the system is still very, very closed, very secretive. And there's no transparency in our correctional system. There's, nobody from the outside gets into that system. So we don't know what's going on.
I wonder whether one of the most difficult things for you as somebody trying to bring this story to the public's attention is the fact that there are a lot of things in this world that we need to care about these days, and getting prisoners' rights, or what's going on behind bars in places that most of us will never go, trying to get that on people's radar screens is hard. How do you get people to care about this?
Right. It's very, very difficult. And I think what we have to think about as a society is, what do we ultimately want from our criminal justice system? We want our police and our courts and everybody to act accordingly and appropriately. And of course, we want, the bad guys, put in jail when they should be. But 98% of prisoners come back out. So who do we want coming back out? Do we want a system that is simply warehousing criminals, or do we want a system that is focused on rehabilitation and supports inside and outside in the community. So, I mean, the people that are in our prisons are, representative of so many systemic issues in our society.
Well, I remember many decades ago the American journalist George Will saying the one thing that ought to animate everybody who deals with the prison issue are two words: sentences end. And
That's right.
and you've hit it on the head there. What kind of people we want coming out of those jails is a hugely important thing. I can't believe this is your first book because it's so damn good. I'm a little jealous. But well
Thank you
done.
very much.
You've
Thank
told you've told a truly important story extremely well. Murder on the Inside, the true story of the deadly riot at Kingston Penitentiary, which happened 50 years ago today. Catherine Fogarty, thanks so much for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.